Hi there. If you're like most people in this day and age, you probably spend way too much time online, and you've probably seen more of this kind of message on the modern web than you care to think about. So these kinds of messages, the reason why they're just so ubiquitous on the web, on just about every website you can think of, is due to some rather ill thought out European regulations that basically say that in order for a website to store cookies in your browser in order to track a user's state, the user's explicit consent must be obtained. And often these messages are quite obnoxious, and they're sort of like pop-up things that obscure some other content that you wanted to access. They actually sort of impair the accessibility of the web to some degree. Not necessarily because web designers like being obnoxious, although perhaps some of them can't help it, but just because the regulation is worded in a particular way and they just can't avoid having to make these messages pop up and have them be in your face all the time. I think that these kinds of pop-up messages and the regulation behind them in general is quite problematic for a whole bunch of reasons. For one, this is European Union regulation, and although a lot of websites are not situated in the EU, websites that can be accessed from within the EU have to comply with this regulation. So it's a bit overreaching in that regard. Secondly, this kind of declaration I don't think is really terribly helpful. Often, most users will just click that accept button to make the pop-up go away so that they can access the content that they visited the website for. So in some respects, these are more of a nuisance, which doesn't really achieve the goal of improving the user's privacy. It's more like an unwanted distraction from all the other ways that an online service might violate a user's privacy. Thirdly, this sort of pictorial representation that many websites use to show you, hey, this site uses cookies and that's a cookie, that's the wrong kind of cookie. So most people, when they think of cookies, they think of like this kind of cookie. And it's hard to relate this to something that stores information inside your web browser. This is the wrong kind of cookie, although it's the kind of cookie that most people imagine. And if you think, and I think that's confusing to a lot of users, they say, hey, do you want to accept cookies? And they think of these, and then they think, and these are just like really sugary, chewy things. And they think, just bear with me for a minute. Yeah, they're like really sweet, chewy things. And they think, what the hell does a sweet, chewy thing have to do with tracking my privacy? Is it like are they trying to bribe me? If I click the accept button, am I going to get dessert? And of course, the type of cookie that does have information baked inside it is a fortune cookie. So the computer scientists who came up with the concept of a cookie, like a small kind of data structure that stores some token of information, they were thinking of fortune cookies. They're sort of like folded bits of pastry with a piece of paper inside it, and that piece of paper has some information encoded in it. Usually in real life, that information is like some prediction about your future, but in computer science, it's more like some way of keeping track of the state of something. So if cookies are so bad, why do they exist at all? Why do we have cookies on the web? Why not just say, okay, no more cookies. No more cookies. No one gets tracked. Everyone's happy. The thing about the web is it didn't really start out in the form that that we now recognize it in today. The web started out as something completely stateless, what do I mean by stateless? I mean non-interactive. You can't interact with, for example, a book in a way that changes its state. Sure, you can look up the table of contents, you can find the information you want to find, and you can turn to that page and you can read that information. But once you've read it, like there's no intelligence in this book that actually keeps track of how you've been interacting with it. There's no like storage within this book to actually remember what you've done and what you've read. So the early web was like that. In fact, the first ever website looked like this. So basically you had a series of documents. Each document is called a web page, and you had these things. Nowadays we call these links or hyperlinks. They were originally called anchors. That's just the term that the inventor of the web went with at the time. And an anchor has a reference to a different web page. When you click on that link, it takes you somewhere else. It takes you to a different internet address or URL. And basically, all the information that the web server knows about you is in that internet address that your web browser has requested. You can either type the internet address or URL into your address bar at the top of your web browser, or you can click a link, and that basically tells the web browser whatever address is sort of embedded in this link, just pop that into the address bar and go there. So to some degree, like a web server could, if whoever was running the web server was crafty enough, they could do various things to keep track of a user's state or session. For example, they could maybe append a series of numbers to the end of an internet address, and then when a user browses that website, maybe keep that same series of numbers at the end of the address of each site they visit. And that way you can keep track of a user's session. Maybe you can keep track of a user's online shopping experience. As they browse around and look at different products, you keep that number in the address bar, and therefore the web server can remember what products the user wants to buy, or what they've added to the cart already. Otherwise, the web is completely not, this early web in its purest form was completely non-interactive. You couldn't really, basically the entire state of what you're doing is in the address bar of the page that you're looking at now. And when you go to a different web page, well, there's no information retained about what you've done or what interaction you've had. So basically cookies were introduced as a way of making the web interactive. The dominant web browser at the time was called Netscape. Well, not at the time, not back in 1991, but Netscape appeared. The first graphical browser was called Mosaic. Netscape appeared fairly soon after that, and Netscape ended up sort of being the main web browser. It was like the web browser that everyone used because it was the only one that had all the features. The early web hadn't been standardized yet, and the people at Netscape basically just kept throwing new features into their web browser, so that you ended up having to use Netscape. Otherwise, you wouldn't get the same experience as everyone else had. And one feature they decided to throw into Netscape was they wanted to pull off a little trick. The first time the user opens their web browser for the first time, or basically every time the user opens their web browser, the web browser usually takes them to like netscape.com. I'm not sure if that website still exists or not, because Netscape went bankrupt a long time ago. But that was like the default homepage. The user opens up Netscape Navigator, they get taken to netscape.com. And the people at Netscape thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could make it so that the first time the user goes to netscape.com, it gives them like a different page, it gives them a different experience, saying, hey, welcome, you look new, here's some stuff that you need to know. And then the second time and subsequent time they visit netscape.com, they get a different experience because now they're a regular user. And they weren't quite sure how to pull this off. They could they could hard code into the web browser that the first time they visit, they get taken to a different URL, a different web page. But instead they came up with this idea of using cookies, which was an old computing concept. Cookies existed back in the 70s when the C programming language was being thought out. There were references to cookies in the C standard library from back in the 1970s. At the time, they were called magic cookies for some reason. Not sure why. And yeah, so someone at Netscape thought, how about when the web server delivers this web page to the user's web browser, it should also deliver a piece of information that should be remembered by the web browser. And then subsequently, every subsequent time you access that web page or that website with a URL starting with that domain name, not only will the web browser request that internet address, but it will also attach to that request all the cookie information that it's been asked to remember. And that will also go with each request. And that was sort of the beginning of the web being interactive, of being able to interact with a website and sort of have your own sort of session with the website where the website remembers who you are as you click each link, and you can kind of have like a session with a website where you might add some items to a shopping cart and then complete a purchase at on a checkout page, or write up an email and then send the email and then check your inbox or something like that. Before that, before cookies, before the concept of storing some information to identify you inside a web browser, to identify your session, that web browser instance became commonplace, that stuff was still sort of possible, but it was a bit more dodgy and it didn't really work so well. So Netscape introduced cookies, and now cookies are sort of needed anytime you have a web page or a website that needs to keep track of a user when they navigate from one part of a site to another part of a site. Without cookies, the sort of interactive web wouldn't really exist, and web pages would still be more like documents like they used to be, rather than interactive applications like they're more like now. And that brings us to the final problem with this kind of message. In order to pull this kind of thing off, in order for a web page to be interactive and to keep track of whether the user has accepted, has provided their consent or not, you need cookies to display this kind of message in the first place. Without cookies, how do you know whether the user's already consented or not? So, that's probably the most glaring reason why this kind of thing is problematic. There would probably be some more sensible ways where the European Union regulators could have implemented this. They could have probably worked with the very few companies that make web browsers and just said, why doesn't the web browser get the user's permission before a website is allowed to store cookies? The web browser already gets your permission before a website uses your microphone or your camera or accesses your location. Why not do the same thing with cookies? After all, it's the web browser that's actually storing those cookies. It's the web browser that's actually managing them. Asking the website to ask your permission to store cookies and having the website actually need to use cookies in order to get your permission, it's a bit of a catch-22. It's a bit back to front. It would be like I don't know. Imagine a world where you use an app on your phone, and instead of like the operating system on the phone saying, do you want to allow this app to use your camera? Imagine if the app already uses your camera, and then it has to get your permission to use your camera. So it says, hey, stand in front of a camera and shake your head if you don't want to provide permission to use your camera. It's kind of silly. But that's the web we have today. Okay, so anyway, that's all I have for you today. What do you think of this video? Please feel free to leave a comment below. And if you like this, well, just make sure to click that like button, because I need all the likes I can get. And I'll see you next time.